When was the last time that you were pleasantly surprised? Something happened that you did not expect to turn out as well as it did or be as interesting as you found. A meal, an article, an encounter, maybe even a podcast, where you found a new and unexpected wrinkle that shone new light on the experience. It turns out that all these small and unexpected delights can be a key for learning and curiosity. Studies reveal that unexpected events trigger our brains to release dopamine, which supercharges attention, memory, and learning. As someone deeply involved in music for decades, I've learned to temper expectations. One can tend to get a little jaded over time, so my list of pleasant surprises with music tend to be pretty modest in nature, like recognizing an artist quoting Third Stone from the Sun in a solo, or hearing an old favorite song on the radio. There's a lot of been there, done that in the music world sooner or later, like anything else, I guess. From that perspective, it's also easy to fall into believing you know most everything about your area of expertise, which in my case is music broadly and roots music especially. But I love it when some new stone is turned over. And luckily, the ensuing dopamine hits keep coming my way, like they did at the 2024 IBMA conference in their series of seminars titled Roots Revival, a Black Stringband Symposium. Much of what those panel events put forward was new to me. Some of it quite revelatory. In recent years, roots music fans have been turning over stone after stone when it comes to the importance of Black artists in traditional music, ranging from the very dawn of string bands up to the current era of bluegrass and beyond. Knowledge of key figures like Arnold Schultz and DeFord Bailey is much more widespread now, thanks in large part to the music of Generation X stars like the Carolina Chocolate Drops and Old Crow Medicine Show, who are succeeded by younger generations of artists like Jake Blunt and Kaya Cater in making their predecessors' stories, along with the broader history and culture, much better known. Tray Wellington took part in the Black Stringband Symposium series, and we caught up after he spoke and played at the seminar titled Black Music in Appalachia, which was one of the 6 hosted by IBMA in partnership with the Banjo Gathering and Elderly Instruments. Tray makes his second appearance on this podcast and brings us new music as well. His song Moon in Motion 1 from his 2024 collection Detour To The Moon is playing now. I'm Joe Kendrick, welcoming you to our episode on Tray Wellington and the Black Stringband Symposium on Southern Songs and Stories. Southern Songs and Stories is a proud part of the lineup at both Public Radio WNCW and Osiris Media, the leading storyteller in music. Follow Southern Songs and Stories wherever you follow podcasts, with more at southernsongsandstories.com. You can engage with us on social media. Southern Songs and Stories is on Facebook at Southern Songs and Stories, on Instagram at South Stories, and my YouTube channel is Joe Kendrick NC. last time I caught up with Tray Wellington for an interview here was the 2022 episode titled Melody, Nuance, and Innovation on the Banjo with Tray Wellington, which coincided with his album Black Banjo, a collection that presented elegant acoustic music that wove in and out of bluegrass, old time, and jazz, often fusing these elements within the same song. Tray's most recent record is Detour To The Moon, which takes his sound even further, and while it travels familiar territory like with a jazz standard on his cover of Caravan, it also features pedal steel guitar from Deshaun Hickman, a cover of the Kid Cudi hit Pursuit of Happiness, and more vocal tracks, with Nick Weitzenfeld, Kaya Cater, and his own singing featured, to name a few examples. More recently, it was a pleasant surprise to see Tray playing banjo alongside dobro master Jerry Douglas as they joined the band Mumford & Sons for their take on the Simon & Garfunkel classic The Boxer on the Saturday Night Live 50th anniversary show. Our conversation starts here with my question about his new collection. Here's Tray Wellington.
Yeah, the reason I kind of call it Detour to the Moon is, one thing like I always try to relate in music is music is so much connected in nature and in how in the way of forward motion. The universe is always moving forward. Time as we look at it is always moving forward. So my idea with this is, it's in my music, you get to a place where you're always ever growing and evolving, and for me that's definitely just such a real thing that I always feel like I'm continually growing. And but sometimes when you're creating an album, for instance, for just a minute you need to take a second and quote unquote take a detour to get this album done, instead of always growing. Sometimes you have to just take a minute to be okay, what am I working on now? And we got to, to get some music out and let people know what you're working on. And so the idea with Detour to the Moon is just taking that idea of let's pause for a minute, let's make a good album to show people what I'm working on now. And then we'll let them go forward for the rest of the adventure.
So the moon, it gives you a hint that it's a little bit farther out there.
Yeah. It's not even further out in terms musically. It's just a hint of this is the first step of we're going to keep growing and keep going out further and further. And it's mostly about just a musical growth thing. Because what we the moon is just the first step from quote unquote from the earth, and so just continually making your music a gradual growth idea.
And what do you like about this record? How's it feel for you?
Yeah, it feels fresh. It feels this is an album that I heard and I was this doesn't sound like anybody else but me. And I think that's probably my favorite part about it is I think it's my best record to date where I've listened to it all the way through and been there's nobody else doing this kind of stuff.
I remember sunshine on my face, a weightless feeling like drifting out in space. Gentle breezes are blowing through your hair, a time suspended, not going anywhere. We were lovers sitting by the beach, no more favors or anyone to please. Warm reflections turning up the heat. In that moment, nothing was as sweet as the taste of your lips and the sway of your hips. It's when we shared a feeling so strong all night long till summer was gone.
A bit of Till Summer Was Gone by Tray Wellington from Detour to the Moon, featuring Tray Wellington on banjo, Drew Matulich playing guitar, Caitlin Bond on upright bass, Josiah Nelson on mandolin and fiddle, Nick Weitzenfeld on lead vocal, and Kaya Cater with harmony vocals. During IBMA's Black Stringband Symposium, conference attendees were treated to discussion panels on black women in folk music, black instrument builders, songs from black traditions that became bluegrass standards, the lasting legacy of black pioneers like Arnold Schultz, the history of archival recordings and how black artists use them today, and the Black Music in Appalachia showcase with our guest Tray Wellington. With over 6 hours worth of discussions interspersed with performances and question and answer, there is way too much material to tackle in this episode, so my focus will be on Tray's panel. However, I encourage anyone who wants to know more about this to contact the folks at the Banjo Gathering or Elderly Instruments or IBMA. I can give you one anecdote that stood out, though. In the Alive in the Archives seminar, Jake Blunt explained how he believes that archives, while ostensibly keeping traditions alive, actually cut people off from living traditions like oral traditions. He went on to describe his dismay at having to pay royalties for using music he drew from in his work, music that was credited to Alan Lomax, but was lifted directly from his black predecessors, without any compensation. Have you ever had something stolen from you and then had to buy it back? I'd be upset too. In the seminar Black Music in Appalachia showcase, Tray Wellington joined banjo maker, human rights activist, and physician Dina Ross Jennings, storyteller and the Tennessee ukulele lady Kelly Jolly, and Lee Bidgood, professor and director of the Institute for Appalachian Music and Culture at East Tennessee State University. It was an hour-long conversation interspersed with songs played and sung by the panelists, with much of the focus on the importance of place in music and the overall culture of the region. As Bidgood stated towards the beginning of this seminar, they were there in part to challenge myths and misconceptions about Appalachia. That of isolation, while the region is and long has been connected to the wider world. That of being a time capsule, frozen in time, while it has actually been fluid, experiencing growth and at times radical change. And that of homogeneity, which can lead outsiders to think that the region is full of Scots-Irish descendants exclusively. While that was not necessarily news to me, some of what came out of that seminar was more or less unknown, like the examples that Dr. Dina Jennings gave about the diversity of black populations within Appalachia, which include black Hispanics, and how those populations learn to unite against discrimination. Afterwards, I asked Tray about hurdles he's faced as a black artist.
Yeah, the biggest thing is just like the passive, it's kind of like not just a bluegrass specific thing, but one of the biggest things is just, a lot of people within the bluegrass realm, the quote unquote, and it's, kind of the same like in the world, sometimes you'll meet people and they just have like a weird reaction. And I'm like, have you never talked to another black person before? You know what I mean? And that's kind of like the biggest hurdle is a lot of people just, they get awkward and they get into a space. And, I've talked to some people about it, closer friends of mine, who at one point, like they had some like, when I first, met them, they might have had some weird behaviors. And, it's like, they were like, oh, it's like the whole worry of like, you don't want to say something like to upset. And I'm like, oh, all you have to do is treat me like a person. That's all I'm asking. And so I'd say that's probably my biggest hurdle is just like getting people to not be, because, even in bluegrass, as even though like, the last 10 years, there's been a big growth in the number of, people of color, at these events. It's still a rare thing, you know what I mean? Like I'm still one of the only, me and my bandmates in New Dangerfield are some of the only touring black musicians in the bluegrass sphere now, and I think it has to be one of those conversations that's just talked about where it's like, it's because this is not a normal, like to a lot of people, it's not like a normal occurrence in their everyday, like going to bluegrass festivals and things like that.
Sure. And keeping with the theme of place, the place where you're from and Piedmont Mountain region, North Carolina and Appalachia, it's always been a more diverse place than what was represented in, say, a lot of roots music. Or a lot of that roots music, was so heavily segregated, or just like so associated with those myths that the moderator had talked about. That was, I think, Lee Bidgood. I think he framed it pretty well. But I forgot where I was going with that. but having more representation for black folks, people of color in the genre was what I meant to say, is that it's you're better represented now, but it's also representational, or just starting to approach the representation that was already there in the community.
Yeah,
it just
yeah.
wasn't in this music part of the community.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I think the area I grew up in, it was a predominantly white area. I think I was like one of like 7 black kids in my entire school, maybe even less than that. And it's but there are like a lot of areas of Appalachia. Boone's one of them, where there's like a really large, number of black families that live there with a lot of traditions. But it is such like people don't want to talk about it. It's like a forgotten part of the Appalachian experience.
And a lot of the key aspects of roots music, whether it be bluegrass, old time, a lot of blues, has that, it's like key ingredients that were foundational, that came from the black community.
Yeah.
And that wasn't necessarily acknowledged, at least not nearly as well as it seems to be now. So do you have any comment about how things are going in that regard?
Yeah, kind of like how things are moving like forward. Yeah, I think they're doing. It's like a lot of steps in the right direction. The biggest thing is still just got to be. It's got to be like done for the right reasons, because people can see right through. I think a lot of times like people like when they're wanting to bring more people, and it's not necessarily for the right reasons. It's because they want to look good on paper to get a grant. You know what I mean, or something like that. And I think it just like all these things need to be done with intention and care. And bringing in people that know how to do that. I think a lot of the time, people keep with their current staff who partially are causing the issues, and they don't, bring in people that know what they're doing in this field of like, making people feel welcome and whatnot.
How much do you think the age comes into play here? It seems to me that younger generations are much more easygoing in this regard, into accepting people, no matter what they look like, into a roots music community, for example. But more so than that, it just seems to me, and I could be wrong, that younger generations are less keyed up about this sort of thing, maybe.
Yeah, I think, I'd say yes and no in a way. I think you find more acceptance in a younger crowd just simply because there's more education, more knowledge out there. But I also think, again, at the end of the day, it's like, younger generations are being raised by an older generation still, you know what I mean? And, obviously, like, younger generations are always, like, going to have people that, challenge those beliefs. But a lot of the time, especially, in certain aspects, like, I think a lot of people, are still going to keep following in those footsteps, unfortunately. And I think it takes people, if you are lucky enough to have somebody that is willing to challenge you in those beliefs and try to get you to open your mind, that's one of the best things you can have. But, a lot of people don't have that, unfortunately. And so they stick in these same mindsets, and it kind of keeps that cycle going. So I would say it's like a yes and no. I'd say it's like, generally yes, but like a lot of times no also.
Yeah. How do you think it like, are we getting beyond, do you see any light at the end of that tunnel? Are we getting beyond tokenism now? I mean, it's existed in film, it's existed in all sorts of, media, entertainment, and it still does. But do you think we're turning the corner?
I don't know if turning a corner is the right way to put it. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. I think, it could be a thing. I think it's really just people, kind of restructuring their thoughts. It's like, I think a lot of the time people get confused with like the idea of like, oh, I'm a black musician. I think some people get confused. They say they think, oh, we need to treat Tray, better than somebody else. And it's like, no, the key factor is, the whole thing in the word in this is equality. And, I just want to be treated like everybody else. I don't want it to be a weird, does that make sense?
Yeah, because I think Kelly Jolly was pointing to that rather strongly in how she was addressed and how she was approached on multiple levels at this one event in particular, and it struck me as like, oh, I can see that as being very true, and I've never experienced that in my life, and now might be one of the first times I've ever really thought about that this way.
Yeah. No, yeah, she did a great job at explaining that.
Yeah. So, my hat's off to you for having to walk that road. It doesn't sound like it's been easy, or it's going to get any easier really right away, at least.
Yeah, it's like something we have a long way to go for, in like a lot of ways. Like I said, I do think it's getting better in a lot of ways, but it's like also, it's still those like, a lot of it's those like little microaggression things, that like people don't even realize they're doing. And I think it comes from a good place, but it takes people being willing to have those conversations and not being like awkward when having those. Because I think a big thing too is like people, and I get it's like a very awkward thing to talk about. It's like awkward to like bring up any of these things, but it's like it's real issues, and like to get better. I think all of our growing moments in life are all about like being put in those uncomfortable positions, like where you have to like be forced to look at yourself and be like, oh, am I like looking at things the right way, or am I like, and you get to, and one lucky thing about being a person is we get to make those decisions for ourselves, and hopefully people will see like, oh, this is like, maybe the way certain micro things I'm doing are making somebody uncomfortable, and maybe I can change those things.
There was a mighty whispering down at the church about the son of a father and a woman got hurt. They were looking all over for someone to pay, and that's you and me, sister, now every day. You gotta lift up every stone now, sister, gotta lift up every stone now, sister, gotta lift up every stone now. Clear this field and stand up tall. Now the sun is bloody red, and when it's gone, someone will be dead. Don't you cry a tear for me, 'cause I did what I could just to be free.
Right in pocket with the tradition of Appalachian murder ballads, that's an excerpt of Tray Wellington's version of a John Hyatt song, Lift Up Every Stone, from his EP Detour to the Moon. In addition to leading his own band, Tray is a member of the roots music supergroup New Dangerfield, which includes Jake Blunt, Kaya Cater, and Nelson Williams. It was at IBMA in 2023 where I saw that group's debut performance. Here's Tray Wellington.
Yeah, it's been amazing. It's a really cool band. It's like me, Jake Blunt, Kai Cater, and Nelson Williams, and it's been really, really incredible. We've really been, working on a lot of new material. We've been, in the studio together. We've done a lot of really cool gigs. Like we started this 1 year ago, thinking this was going to be like a one-off band. For IBMA, just something to like, do that they were asking about. And then, it just turned into, like we've played Newport Folk Festival, and we've played, some of the biggest folk festivals in the country in 1 year of, starting this band. It's kind of like a crazy thing, but, like our mission, and the thing like I love so much about it is, we're very clear about our mission, and it seems like people are really receptive to that.
Well, more power to you, and I hope the change is going to keep going positive, keeps in a positive direction. And
thank you.
Best wishes for Detour to the Moon. I know it's a quality music. I've seen you play some of it live this week, and it's just a real trip.
Thank you.
Wrapping up our episode with Spiral Staircase, the Tray Wellington original from his collection Detour to the Moon. Tray is set to play many dates in spring 2025 with both New Dangerfield as well as his own band. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and we hope you can help us again by sharing a word about what we're doing. It's as easy as telling a friend and following this podcast on your platform of choice. From there, it takes just a moment to give us a top rating, and where it's an option, a review. It makes a great difference because the more top reviews and ratings we get, the more visible we become to everyone on apps like Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and TuneIn, which means that more people just like you connect with artists like Tray Wellington. This series is a part of the lineup of both Public Radio WNCW and Osiris Media, with all the Osiris shows available at osirispod.com. You can also hear new episodes on Bluegrass Planet Radio at bluegrassplanetradio.com. Thanks also to Jacqueline Anthony for producing the radio adaptations of this series on Public Radio WNCW, where we worked with Joshua Ming, who wrote and performed our theme songs. I'm your host and producer, Joe Kendrick, and this is Southern Songs and Stories, the music of the South and the artists who make it.